science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Today I am bringing you a special episode because with this we are hoping to advertise and inaugurate a new series as a part of this podcast, which is our live conversations. On June 24th for 2 hours at 9 a.m. PST, 12 noon EST, we will be having a live panel discussion in which I will have a conversation with my friends Tony Vidler from the Cooper Union, Mark Jazambek from the MIT, Partha Mithar from the UK, and Sunil Kilnani, the Indian historian, in which we will ask the question, is mid-century Indian modernism still relevant today? Whereas on the one hand, you can say mid-century modernism is clearly obsolete because its politics and ethics and aesthetics in many ways are now considered to have been of the past, and many mid-century buildings are, as most of you would know, being destroyed or reconfigured every day around the world. But on the other hand, the mid-century moment seems to enjoy an unexpected renaissance in the art world, where its art and furniture is sold for fantastic prices, but also in the world of environmental thinking, where the impending climate crisis recovers for us the question of having to design our cities and infrastructures in a manner that is coherent with the drastic and massive changes that we need today, which is a kind of thinking that very much has its roots in the mid-century moment of the past. The starting point for this conversation is my book, which has just been published, One Continuous Line, Art, Architecture and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash, which is the narrative of the life and work of my father, which is now out in the public realm. But using that as a starting point, we will move on to discuss a wide variety of questions that take on the legacy of the mid-century moment, both in terms of nationalism, neo-nationalism, the climate crisis, preservation, and so on. Please join us for that. The link to register for that can be found on Architecture Talk page, and it is going to be on June 24th, Thursday, June 24th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. It'll be a good conversation with opportunity for Q&A. So please do register for it and join the conversation. Meanwhile, to prep for it, here is an interview that my friend Ayad Rahmani conducted with me, discussing my book, One Continuous Line, its ideas and imperatives. I hope you enjoy today's conversation and will register and be there for the webinar. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Ayad Rahmani and I'm a professor of architecture at Washington State University. I'm delighted to have with me today Vikram Prakash. He is a professor of architecture at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he teaches courses in global history, theory, and design. Today we meet to discuss his forthcoming book, One Continuous Line, slated to be published by Mappin Publishing Company later this year, 2019. Vikram, welcome.
Thank you, Ayad. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for this conversation opportunity.
Wonderful. I wanted to start by asking about the title of the book. It is a unique title and one that is suggestive, and I was wondering if you could give us an elaboration on it.
Well, it's One Continuous Line, the Art, Architecture and Urbanism of Aditya Prakash. And the art, architecture and urbanism is designed to indicate the multidisciplinarity, the multidisciplinary nature of the work that Aditya Prakash did. And the One Continuous Line talks about his quest and my search for the thread or the threads that connect and tie them all together.
I see.
So it is a search, a quest that the one continuous line refers to.
Well, along those lines, maybe we could talk about the purpose of the book and the time that it is coming out. What do you think is the reason for the book? And is this a particularly important time for it to come out?
Well, it's 2019.
Yeah.
And I think there are sort of two levels about the question of timing. One is it's 11 years since Aditya Prakash died.
Mm-hmm.
And he is, as most listeners and viewers would know, my father.
That's right.
And I think it takes a son about that much time to digest and regurgitate and rethink and represent and begin to interpret what it means to inherit and write about a father's legacy.
Right.
So that explains, let's say, the long time it took to put this book together.
Yeah.
And that's why it's coming out in 2019.
That's right.
But it is also, I think, an important and apposite time to bring this book out, Ayad, because the Nehruvian legacy, the modernist ethos of the 50s and 60s is simultaneously, being valorized and museumized, as we know, for instance, from the kind of rush on the genre chairs of the 1950s that is currently going on, at least in the West, in Paris and New York, Chicago. So there is sort of a revalorization of mid-century modernism that is certainly very much in play, and the work that Aditya Prakash did certainly belongs to the center of that thinking. So there is that. But on the other hand, there is also a run on modernism and the mid-century ethos in the sense that it is being put to bed. A lot of mid-century modernist work is being destroyed.
That's right.
Brutalism is under attack. Structures are being torn down every day as we speak around the world, including several of Aditya Prakash's.
Right.
But even more than that, in places like India, the Nehruvian legacy, the sort of the thinking of that times, the aspirations of the nations that were set up by people like Nehru and by officers of the Nehruvian era like Aditya Prakash and others of that time, is under threat. The current leadership and political leadership in India, for instance, certainly over here in the United States, seems to think that the modernist age should be was a massive error and a massive mistake and led to the downfall.
Right.
So in that sense, it is a good time also to talk about those times and what its inheritance was.
That's right. Well, that's interesting because your dad was both a critic of the modern project in India, but also an admirer and a supporter of it. He championed the cause of Le Corbusier in India, setting up and building Chandigarh. But he was also adamant that local culture, indigenous culture, made its way into that modernization, that it wasn't forgotten. He went out of his way to, at one point, research local markets, local means of transportation, going about one's daily life. And so one can easily see him as a conflicted figure about this time in India, about the modernization project. But he might have been simply trying to bring or marry two worlds together. What's your take on these sort of Janus face approach to modernism?
Yeah, Ayad, you have put it really well. So in this book, and I think as you have correctly identified, these sort of actors and agents of modernism, of mid-century modernism, are of course not to be understood as uncritical propagandists or apologists of modernism,
Right.
which is often how they are portrayed,
Right.
which is how often the question of the legacy of modernism is addressed. And certainly that is a problem when we think about sort of second level modernists like Aditya Prakash, who are seen in the post-colonial frame, in third world conditions, in working in those conditions, as seeing as people who might be criticized for uncritically carrying the flag of modernism
Right.
and of the great heroes of modernity. And that is completely erroneous. And there may be some of that
Right.
in some actors, and that could be criticized. But Aditya Prakash certainly was not one of those. He learned very significantly from modernism. He was a great believer in the veracity of the kernel of the Nehruvian, and one could argue the modernist Le Corbusian Jeanneret project. But his adherence and fidelity to that project took the form of critique. And a critique that was not only about bringing indigeneity or Indianness to it, but was about understanding the Indian condition and ethos with the view of criticizing the modernist project itself.
Right.
Not in the sense of like criticizing it, like sort of a postmodernist critique,
Right.
but in the sense of critiquing it so that it could be advanced further.
Right.
So he saw his sort of introduction of the animal, of self-sustainable thinking, of the Indian bazaar,
Right.
of the market, of sort of a more multi-species way of looking at the modernist project rather than anthropocentric project as an advancement of modernism via critique.
Right. I mean, he was not really a politician. He didn't enter politics
No.
While in India. But at one point in his life, and specifically after, I think, retiring from the Chandigarh College of Architecture, he did start writing and contributing opinions to the rise of perhaps postmodernity, the role of the modern project in general in India, the extent to which we may have forgotten certain aspects of the past. What's your take on his interest in Indian politics? To what extent did he enter, leave, stay on the sidelines of Indian politics? Or was he ever accepted as a sort of an ambassador of architecture to Indian culture?
To Indian politics, yeah, I would say, yeah, he never entered politics. And in that sense, you know, he can be criticized for not taking the political theater or the political stage as a site of action. He saw himself as an administrative officer in the classic 19th or early 20th century colonial sense,
Right.
as a steadfast performer of the functions and roles and expectations
Right.
of a officer of the Indian government.
Right.
And he expected the politicians to commission him to do the work that he was trained to do, rather than seeing himself as a person who actually entered into the theater of politics himself.
Right. Right.
So in that sense, I would argue that after the generation of the Nehrus and the Gandhis of the 50s, 40s, and really 40s and early 50s, he's pretty much stepped out of the political theater.
Right. At one point, he makes a decision to teach or to run a school. He was invited to do that, and if I read the text well, he was conflicted about that decision a little bit, at least. But finally, he made it.
Yeah.
He confirmed it. I suppose I have two questions on that note. Do you feel that he was in full control of that decision? Namely, that he made it as from a source of strength, or was it a source of frustration? Because of certain events going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And my interest in this case is also your take on that decision.
Right.
Now that you've become, obviously you've become a professor at the University of Washington, how do you evaluate that point of view or that stance?
Yeah. So his tenure as principal of the Chandigarh College of Architecture from late 1967 to 1982 is a fraught chapter of his career.
Yes.
It was a difficult time in India as the Nehruvian nation state was coming apart.
That's right.
And so that certainly also played into the sort of difficulties that the Chandigarh College of Architecture, for instance, experienced late in the 1970s,
Right.
in the form, in particular, of a series of student-led strikes, which I think quite disillusioned him as to the purposes of the School of Architecture or the College of Architecture and his role as a pedagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for him, a School of Architecture was very clearly an applied research institution.
Yes.
He wanted the Chandigarh College of Architecture to be a place where theses on applied architecture and applied urbanism would be tested in the field
Yes.
and then learned and built on.
Right.
And he saw the job of training architects as the job of building the urban environment and indirectly building the nation,
That's right.
not necessarily that of training hireable graduates.
Very interesting.
Now, so he sort of, so that's how he saw the School of Architecture, as a very applied sort of a place.
Right.
And I think he would have happily remained in practice and even left academia 2 or 3 times if he could swing the opportunity.
Right.
So he was a reluctant academic in that sense.
Right. Yeah.
Because the academic institution never quite lived up to this extremely high aspiration that he had of it.
Right. Right.
So that's a controversial chapter of his oeuvre, and I've sort of placed it in the middle of the book.
Right.
But in my analysis at the end, in the last chapter, I more or less sidestepped that question.
Yeah.
And I might be sidestepping it, as you perhaps have picked up,
Right. Yeah.
because of my own involvement in academia.
That's right.
My investment in academics comes much more from a theoretical history theory perspective,
That's right. Yeah.
a global history, a sort of intellectual thinking perspective.
Right.
And in that sense, we could almost describe this as my father and I were rivals in our interpretations of the inheritance, the modernist inheritance, whereas for him the modernist inheritance was a strongly practice-focused, applied inheritance which had to be critiqued and advanced, whereas for me the modernist inheritance is much more intellectual
Yes.
and conceptual and theoretical.
Right.
So
Was that because of the place, the fact that Chandigarh was building from nothing, and that this was a project of tremendous importance, or was it truly his ethic about the role and ways of learning architecture?
I think it's very much connected to the Chandigarh project.
Yeah.
The Chandigarh project was a doing project.
Yeah, doing project, exactly.
It was first declared that it was going to be done, and then it was asked, what are we going to do?
Right. Yeah.
And that played straight into his conception of what it meant to be a practicing man.
Yes.
And it was built up by the administrators and the engineers of India, built up in that way by Nehru, and certainly built up by that way by people like Corbusier. And their, Corbusier once wrote, they all talk about it, but Pierre and I, we just went and did it.
Oh.
He mentions that specifically about Chandigarh. He was, because Siam was coming apart, in the 1950s and early 60s, and that was his critique, that these people just sit around and talk about it, but we just went and built the city.
Right.
So it was very much a doing ethos. So that's how I think very much that's where it comes from.
Interesting. At one point you talk about postmodernism and how it made its way into the Indian market, if you will. And I hadn't heard that, and it struck me as being an important sort of chapter in the history and understanding of Indian architecture. I have always thought of it as a Western entity limited to the United States and Europe, but in this case it seemed to have also affected the Indian setting. And I was wondering what kind of debate was there about that, and how did your father enter that debate, if he did at all?
Well, by the mid-1970s, as postmodernism was taking flight, particularly here in the United States, with Charles Jenks's books and sort of the supposed death of modernism with Pruitt-Igoe and so on, Corbusier became the whipping boy of modernism.
I see.
And with that, Chandigarh's coin, in a sense, flipped from being the sort of this grand projet of the great modernist in the global sphere to being the, vilified project of modernism. And suddenly Chandigarh was under question, which on the one hand played straight into Aditya Prakash's critiques of Chandigarh, because he called Chandigarh an escapist city. He called it unsustainable. He called it, not driven to, animal unfriendly. He called it, many things in his books. But the critique that came was not in this direction. Today we talk about sustainability and urbanism and everything, but in the 70s the critiques of modernism were all about, lack of historical referentiality.
That's right.
And how architecture should be more coded through historical formal characteristics and cultural indexing.
Right.
And this was not a thing that Aditya Prakash was at all interested in.
Right. Right.
And he thought that was precisely a evisceration of the fundamental ethos or drive of the modernist world, which he was not prepared to do. So postmodernism, as it took over, coming out of Americas and the Europe, traveled into places like India and perhaps places like Iraq and certainly, a lot of the Middle East, as this drive to produce an Indian aesthetic. And it took over a lot of the major Indian architects.
Right.
And at that point, Prakash felt that he would had to step, that not only was his move to try and make the city and its architecture some more sustainable not being heard, but what was being championed was a kind of an architecture that he could not subscribe to at all.
That's right. Yeah, postmodernism felt that, the postmodern architects felt that architecture was being forgotten as a work of history, as even a work of perhaps even theory, and it was important to give it a look, a spectacle. And perhaps that narrative found its way into the Indian architectural market, namely that Chandigarh was a harsh introduction of concrete and features that were alien to the Indian setting, and sort of this postmodernism was an immediate response, an urgent response to reverse things and call into place
Right.
a historical idiom, a historical significance to the city. And we do see that your father, at one point, taking the time to research how people went about places, how they engaged the markets and streets and not plazas, but open settings. So there seems to be a concern on behalf of your father that the way we were approaching and understanding buildings was less about how people use it and much more about how people look at it.
Right.
But does that make sense? Is that accurate?
That's totally accurate.
Yeah.
So when he was looking at the Indian market,
Yeah,
he was not looking for formal characteristics
exactly.
that were historicist and symbolic and referential. Rather, he was looking at how the city functioned today and how it was being treated by and responding to the transformations of the modernist age, and what was being lost and what was being gained, and whether we were throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and how was that to be restituted and corrected.
Exactly.
Versus saying that modernism is an iconoclastic project, and therefore it must itself be destroyed, negated, with the idea of resurfacing a more formal historicism.
Exactly. It's difficult to read your book and to know you as a person and not to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism.
Okay.
So maybe my next question goes in that direction.
It has to go in that direction.
It has to go into that direction. And in your last chapter, I think it was the conclusion, you talk about something really interesting, and that is translation as a form of corruption. That in translating something, you inevitably corrupt it. And perhaps your dad, your father, looked at translating Corbu's work into something that is amenable to the local worker, and as such corrupting the modernist project to and adapting it to local culture. How do you understand that? I mean, to me, this seems to be a project about. It's a nuanced approach to empowering the local in a way that the colonial project might completely sort of take him out of the picture. This was an attempt to leave the image, perhaps to leave the ethic of the modern project, but also do it in such a way that the local worker is not washed away in the process.
Right.
What's your take on this topic?
So Ayad, as you have mentioned, the way I've set up the book, the conceit of the book, is that the bulk of its chapters are more. The bulk of its chapters are more documentary.
Yes.
They try and outline the basic facts with a certain interpretive framework and try and foreground the visual material. The last chapter is set up as a highly interpretive essay, where I try and marshal all my theoretical arsenal to look at this material more critically.
Correct, yeah.
And you see in that already a kind of a colonial, post-colonial kind of a problem, where the post-colonial problem always is how to articulate your own voice, given the difficulty of dealing with a topic and a subject and a figure that is in a position of overlordship or superiority of paternity to you.
Right.
And this was the Indian problem with respect to the West. This is the same problem I have with respect to my father. It's the same problem he had with respect to Le Corbusier, and so on and so forth.
Right, right.
So I've tried to deal with that problem by making this split. successfully or unsuccessfully. And my theory, my learned theory and sort of my advocated theory is that the best way to kind of deal with this situation is through a carnivalization, is through parody, irony, is through representing, but in a, let's say, corrupted fashion, which is what carnivalization is. It's perilous to say, oh, I have no influence of the authority figure. It is equally perilous to say, well, I just serve. I am a loyal foot soldier and I serve faithfully and I am to be,
I deliver the goods.
I deliver the goods,
Yes.
and therefore I should be praised
I'm
and
simply
thanked.
the messenger.
I'm
Yes.
simply the messenger.
Yeah.
So both those are perilous.
Yeah.
So finding your own voice in that condition is to actively corrupt, is to use but misuse, right?
Right.
And I think I try and argue that that's a theory in general that can be found even in the work, not only in the book, in my position, but even in the way Prakash went about dealing with modernism, dealing with Corbusier, dealing with the modular, and dealing with the Nehruvian legacy. He used and also abused, and therefore corrupted. And I argue that that's a kind of an active agency, a way to do things which is productive, much more interesting than the sort of postmodernist argument of returning to the authenticity of your true self, negating the father, negating the figure that went before you, which is simply symptomatic. So that is how I introduced that concept. And I further tried to further that concept by saying that actually it's a two-way mirror. It's a two-way process. It's a double echo. It's a diffractive process, in the sense that this is how modernism or Corbusier would also continues to live, to be vivified, to be verified in its corrupted reading. So it, in that sense, makes Corbusier not via fidelity, but via corruption.
Yeah, I have to admit that, and maybe I'm making too big of a deal about this point, but one of the more touching moments in the book, and it happens in the conclusion, is when you talk about your father taking the brick, the Western-sized brick, and adapting it to an Indian modular brick system. For me, it might be a passing point and nobody cares, but it shows a man who cares about both sides of the equation, if you will. On the one hand, retaining the modern project, its essence, the qualities that made it a powerful entity and something to believe in as a culture, but also not in such a way where it eradicates the role and power of the local individual, be it an architect or a laborer. That moment shows a degree of sophistication and sensitivity that you can really argue that was what was needed in the transition from the modern to the postmodern that was never really picked up. I found that to be quite formative for my vision of my understanding of modernism and how it can be appropriated or adapted to a local culture.
That's a great insight I had, and the way I would look at it, and what I'm learning from you is that it's not simply a matter of kind of diffractive echoing. What is interesting about what Prakash did, and what he did was he looked at sort of the abstract mathematical geometries of Le Corbusier's modular and sort of, in a sense, pragmatized them against the set dimensions of the Indian brick, and therefore corrupted them or diffracted them. That is not simply a matter of cross-echoing, but it is also a very specific kind of cross-echoing in the sense that it gives dignity
Right.
to the humble Indian brick.
Exactly.
And with that, to the mason that lays that brick.
Exactly.
And with that, in both cases, helps to articulate and give voice to the subaltern subject. Because the subaltern subject, the worker, the mason, not to speak of the innumerable women who work the Indian sites, remain unaccounted for, unvoiced, unrecognized in this sort of global arguments between the architects of the East and the West and the Nehrus and the Corbs and the so on and so forth. The subaltern remains unspoken for, and even if does Prakash's work fully speak for the subaltern? Can the subaltern speak? We know that's a controversial question.
Right.
At least his work establishes or opens a pathway or a gateway, or better, turns its ear towards trying to listen to the subaltern voice in that way. And that, I think, was an important ethic of his project.
Right.
It was not so much about making things Indian or local.
Right.
It was being attuned, trying to make modernism more attuned to the subaltern agency.
Exactly. Exactly. You mentioned words, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit. In reading, in approaching the book, and again, knowing you for a number of years now, I was expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, but but I was expecting a work in which theoretical rhetoric was jumping around and playing with lots of ideas and critiques, and perhaps entering into a Freudian analysis of scenarios, since he is your father and you're talking about. But the rhetoric remains disciplined, I would say elegant, clear, but disciplined and quiet. Were you conscious of your choice of that rhetoric, or some other factors were entering the scene?
I was very conscious of the choice of the rhetoric, and I must credit the Indian English art historian Partha Mitter for this.
I see.
Because I was at a conference at Bauhaus in Germany with him, and he's a well-established art historian, and I showed him the material of my father, and I said, I don't know how to write it. And he said, you write it quietly. You just, keep the rhetoric down and write a straightforward book, privilege the visual, and you will be okay. So I'm indebted to Partha for giving me the license and the wheels to start writing it.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was intentional.
Interesting.
But I suppose symptomatically one could also read it as an opportunity, as a way to not get into the fray and not be controversial.
Were you ever tempted to veer away, move in a slightly different direction?
Oh, many times.
Yeah.
But I was always much too symptomatically tempted to sort of glorify his work.
Right.
Which is, I think, still a problem in the narrative, somewhat. My challenge moving ahead is to, try and represent this in a way that is neither glorified nor documentary, but truly tries to make something more interesting out of this as part of my broader palette of topics. We had a review yesterday that you participated in. Thank you for doing that. The suggestion was made that can I bring his work into orbit, into critique, with my love and obsession with the fashion of Alexander McQueen.
That's right, yeah.
So that would be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah,
I want to sort of weave this work also into the textile of all my other subjects. Perhaps sometime soon. I'm not sure I'm totally ready for that.
Yeah. How would you like to see critics like myself and others, teachers, architects, use the book, look at it as a perhaps form of critique of whether it's Indian architectural setting or other aspects of contemporary culture? Is there an idea, or would you like to see the book advance in a way that advances something that we are experiencing today?
I would like you and everybody else to use the book as an introduction to the archive of Aditya Prakash.
Okay.
His archive now sits at the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal. And I would like you and other people to have at that material as you will.
Well, we will. We will for sure.
I'm
Thank
sure
you.
you will.
Maybe on a last note, maybe a note of memory. Is there one particular memory growing in your father's household that stayed with you that you would like to share, with us, the audience of the book, and just to advance it even further than where it is now?
That's a good question. I've tried to put a lot of memories into italicized quotes in the book itself.
Yes.
But I think the memory I would like to foreground is that of the sense of my father retreating into his art studio in a disciplined manner every day, painting, writing on the walls, painting on the walls.
That's right.
Writing books, and contemplating what his life is. Just before he died, in fact, like 2 days before he died, he said to me that he in fact thought the best years of his life had been after he retired.
Wow.
And I know that early on after he retired, he felt dislocated and sort of abandoned, because it's mandatory retirement in India when you turn 58. I'm 55 now, so I can't imagine retiring in 3 years.
Right. Oh no.
In the middle of my career,
I don't see
feel
you
like
doing that.
I'm starting to just do my best work,
That's
and,
right.
and suddenly I'm asked to retire.
That's right.
So it would be quite castrating. But by the end of his life, he finally came to the conclusion that those were the best years of his life. And I think those are connected to him sort of sloughing off the burden of having to earn a livelihood,
Right.
and really being the contemplative soul that he was.
Yes.
So that studio of his still exists in Chandigarh.
Oh, does it?
It's a beautiful space.
Wonderful.
Obviously, I can't,
Yes.
give the walls over to the archive. I wish I could.
Yes.
But who knows what will become of it. But I've included some photographs of his studio as he left it in the book.
Yes.
And those are memorable photographs which have a strong sense of his presence. And that's what comes to mind.
Wonderful. Well, Vikram, I want to thank you so much for writing the book, for being such a wonderful friend over the years, and for teaching me about a part of the world that I've always loved but did not know as much as you mentioned. So thank you so much for it, and I wish you all the best with it.
Thank you, Ayad. Thank you for taking the time to read the book, for preparing these questions, for being here, for conducting this wonderful interview, for being a friend,
Thank you.
and for being a fellow post-colonial.
That's right. That's right.
We also,
My pleasure.
Yeah,
My
thank
pleasure.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.